Alright, today I'm here for a very exciting lecture, and this is going to be on Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus. We're going to be specifically looking at the first plateau, which they don't want this book to be in chapters, they specifically call it a plateau, and we'll talk about what that is. But it's called Rhizome. We're going to talk about exactly what Deleuze and Guattari mean by the rhizome, and how this creates the impetus of creativity and newness and multiplicity within their philosophy that is going to be rebelling against certain strains in philosophy. Now, Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is particularly interesting. This book in particular will just get your heart racing by just reading it. It's really quite exhilarating. And this, I think, more so than Anti-Oedipus, and I haven't read the whole thing yet, obviously, so I can't give you a super definitive answer to this, but it seems to be more explosive than Anti-Oedipus. It's all about breaking out through these lines of flight, and I'm going to be basically going over a number of terms that Deleuze and Guattari use, and we're going to look at the 6 principles of the rhizome. We'll talk about what lines of flight are, we'll talk about assemblages, we'll talk about reterritorialization and deterritorialization, and maybe a few others. Now, the rhizome is a very different take on ontology, and Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get away from transcendent structuring structures. They want to get out of this realm of reproduction, and they want to get to production, genuine newness and genuine difference and multiplicity, because they think that a great problem with, really we could say Hegel, is Hegel wants to make his philosophical system fully encompassing. And by doing this, he actually fails to understand difference qua difference. He understands difference as sameness, as the one. And we're going to see how Deleuze and Guattari use the idea of the rhizome to actually break out of this idea of transcendent oneness or anything like that. In essence, Deleuze and Guattari's work can be said to be giving us one imperative: produce. They want us to produce using flows of desire that are within us, that structure sociality and structure the state and things that become concretized over time. And they want us to figure out what are the lines of flight we can use to break out of these structures. And for them, structure is a very dirty word. Instead of structures, they want to talk about assemblages. Now, it's helpful when talking about the rhizome to just get a picture of what it is, which is to say, it actually comes from biology, and it's kind of a root, but it's not a root. It's not a root at all. In fact, it is a sort of heterogeneous structure. This is what potatoes are, by the way. Potatoes are rhizomes. The rhizome can be compared to, this is rhizomatic thinking, and this is arborescent thinking. Now, Deleuze and Guattari say that this is usually how we think of ontology. We've got being, and it is structured in some kind of root, some place from which it emerges, and that all the stuff that grows out of it is in reference to the arborescent structure, the roots, so to speak. Whereas for the rhizome, it doesn't converge on these central points, the junction between the roots and the trunk, or the trunk and the branches. Instead of focusing on centrality, the rhizome shoots off these different structures. It is unlocalizable insofar as it merely spreads as it needs to. When nutrients are in a certain spot, it branches off in that direction and searches for nutrients and breaks off into these appendages, which go on to influence the rest of the rhizome. So the important thing to know about the rhizome is that, in a sense, this is what roots do too. You know, the seed creates roots that shoot down and the trunk that shoots up, and it is trying to live too. But in trying to live, it makes a very definite structure. And with the rhizome, instead of this unified structure, it's a structure of multiplicity where all the changes are connected to the rhizomatic assemblage as a whole. And each of these little offshoots and branches affects the rest of the rhizome, such that we can see that rhizomatic thinking is a better way of thinking about social conditions, because humans are social. If you read Anti-Oedipus, or if you watched any of my lectures on Anti-Oedipus, you'll know that they want to view beings as being constituted by flows, and that partial objects emerge on this body without organs, which is sort of their structural matrix, so to speak, but which is responsive to the partial objects on top of it that are superimposed over it. And by looking at ontology as a series of flows and a series of intensities, of intensive differences, this would be things like differences in pressure that you see on like your meteorological maps of like cold fronts and stuff. These are intensities which collide together and create partial objects, these tubers and shoots and other stuff. Deleuze and Guattari are very clear that their language is oriented towards objects, so to speak, but even this is not necessarily correct, but entities which exist socially. They exist insofar as they are intensive differences in an assemblage. They say all we talk about are multiplicities, lines, strata, and segmentarities, lines of flight and intensities, machinic assemblages and their various types, bodies without organs and their construction and selection, the plane of consistency, and in each case, the units of measure. Which is to say, they're more so worried about difference than they are about unity. When you read someone like Hegel, he's very insistent upon the unity within the one, that in fact difference is mere appearance, and in fact difference is only known as appearance through perception in the mind, and it creates this sort of interiority where we never really get to things in themselves except through dialectical sublation, which eliminates the things in themselves and makes them things for Geist, insofar as they are Geist. They become transmuted in this process of acquiring them. Deleuze and Guattari want to say, okay, if we really want to talk about reality and understand reality, we have to in fact understand it as a process. They say, in truth, it is not enough to say, long live the multiple, difficult as it is to raise that cry. No typographical, lexical, or even syntactical cleverness is enough to make it heard. The multiple must be made, not by always adding a higher dimension, but rather in the simplest of ways, by dint of sobriety, with a number of dimensions one already has available. Which is to say, Deleuze and Guattari want us in this imperative to produce, like they said before. They want us to use what is available. They want us to orient our action in the rhizomatic way of thinking, where things can be chopped off and things can be added and multiplied and shifted and altered. And the rhizome is not a definite entity. If you look at any rhizome and compare it to another one, it will be totally unique. So rhizomaticism is more of a process of production, a process of deterritorialization, which is to say the tree has a very definite territory insofar as it has a very clear form of what exactly is the territory that represents the tree, the space taken up by the matter that is the tree. And this insistence on territoriality is going to create binary structures whereby we have things like subject and object. And of course, as soon as we make this subject-object split and we split ourselves off from the rest of production that is outside of ourselves, then we go into arborescent thinking. Then we start to think platonically and we start to think, oh, there are some more perfect forms of which the things I perceive are deficient emanations. This is like when Hegel says that something is only insofar as it is for perception, which is to say that the isness of reality, as soon as we make this subject-object split, is going to always turn reality into a deficient thing insofar as reality only is for the subject. And this binarism has been created by this definition of territory. Whereas with the rhizome, it is defined by this process of deterritorialization, whereby possibilities are opened up, or rather are impregnated within the structure. This is an important part of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, is that these lines of flight, these ways of escaping out of the territory are always latent within content. And using these lines of flight, these, because really the lines of flight for the tree are harder to acquire because of such a specific structure. But when we try to get past this kind of representationalist way of thinking of things as subject and object, and we look at pure productive flows and capacities, we start to be able to see a lot more clearly our lines of flight, our ways out, our ways of traversing intensities, and using these intensities to come up with newness precisely by analyzing structures of reality, and reality insofar as it is desire. This is where, if you first pick up Capitalism and Schizophrenia, because this is a 2-volume series. There's Anti-Oedipus and then there's 1,000 Plateaus. And you read Capitalism and Schizophrenia, you get quite clearly that they are not fans of psychoanalysis as it's understood by Freud with things like the Oedipus complex. This is the principal thrust, or the critical thrust, of Anti-Oedipus, is going against or contra Oedipus. Not necessarily the negation of Oedipus, but rather insisting on the real, saying that Oedipus might work, but it also might not work sometimes. And by doing this, where we restrict what is real to that which is understood through a significatory structure, we understand what is our real desire through Oedipus, through the phallus, through the castration complex, these things of Freud and Lacan. When we do that, we in fact create this very binary and apparently unified structure. But chief among Deleuze and Guattari is they do want to engage in psychoanalysis, but they do not want to do Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalysis. Instead, they want to do a form of psychoanalysis which they call schizoanalysis. They want to use schizophrenia as their model for how exactly ontology really is, which is to say that the rhizomatic assemblage is essentially schizophrenic. It takes these random lines of flight, kind of like they talk about Lenz's stroll at the beginning of Anti-Oedipus, who is this guy who's a schizophrenic, and he's like, oh, I was missing a stomach, and my stomach disappears, but then sometimes before meals, my stomach just reappears out of the ether so that I may quench its hunger. It's like, okay, yeah, he's schizophrenic. But Deleuze and Guattari want to use this model to say that these experiences which the schizophrenic is experiencing is a productive experience insofar as it is a unique experience. And their question is not, why is that a wrong experience? How are we going to get to the fundamentals, to the roots of experience, where we have this kind of line between appearance and reality? They want to say, no, there is only the real, and the real, because of that, is necessarily going to be a product of desire. The things that appear are a product of desiring, of flows of desire. This is kind of like they ask, usually we like to think, oh, how could a Nazi soldier have been fooled into doing such heinous acts? Or how could people in Nazi Germany have been fooled to entertain such heinous policies? But Deleuze and Guattari want to ask, not that that want is merely apparent, that actually, no, they didn't want it, but they had been fooled. Deleuze and Guattari want to say, no, that desire was present there, and Hitler and people of the Third Reich brought it out such that it could be realized. And the question is not, how can we figure out they didn't want that? But rather, how can we figure out how that want came to be expressed? And this process of expression occurs through these lines of flight, which drive deterritorialization. In Hegel, his driving force is reason, this unifying process which sublates things in the process of coming to the one. For Deleuze and Guattari, the line of flight is our teleological mover, so to speak. But teleology is the wrong way to think about Deleuze and Guattari. They don't think that this is oriented towards some definite end. They are very clear that they are anti-determinists. Rather, these lines of flight merely drive difference and drive this flow of difference which they're trying to get at. Now, Deleuze and Guattari entertain 6 principles of the rhizome. And these principles are the principle of connection, the principle of heterogeneity, the principle of multiplicity, the principle of asignifying rupture, the principle of cartography, and the principle of decalcomania. Now we're going to go through these one at a time to make sense of them. The principle of connection is to say that any point on the rhizome can be transmuted for any other point. Which is to say, not that the rhizome is equivalent all around. This is like a mistaken, like monist kind of way of thinking, where the monists think, oh, everything is actually just the one, and differences are just mere appearances, because the one is being itself, and if being is in everything, then everything is essentially reduced to being. Deleuze and Guattari don't think that. What they want to say is that the rhizome is so heterogeneous that you can take any point and you can put it on any new point, and this is the way by which the rhizome functions, by no point being reducible to any other point, such that it displays this radical connectivity by which it allows these lines of flight to open up by the changes internal to the rhizome. The second principle is the principle of heterogeneity, which is closely linked to this first one, but which is to say that the rhizome is not reducible to the one or the many, which is to say it does not take the form of a sedentary, transcendent object with a unified meaning. It is not reducible to the rhizome with a capital R, to this transcendent idea with a capital I, or the notion, Begriff in Hegel. But neither is it simply reducible to the many. It is not a single point and a single point and a single point and a single point, all of which come together to create an assemblage. No, instead, the rhizome is defined by action and by process. They're not so much concerned with structure, no. They want to favor process over schema or structure or substance. They think that the rhizome is not defined by a substance, but rather is defined by its principle of action, this deterritorialization, and the reterritorialization by which the rhizome will tend towards an order. So there's this battle, which we even see in Hegel, which is continued in Deleuze and Guattari, and this is the result that gives us the imperative to produce. They say, a rhizome ceaselessly establishes connections between semiotic chains, organizations of power, and circumstances relative to the arts, sciences, and social struggles. A semiotic chain is like a tuber, agglomerating very diverse acts, not only linguistic, but also perceptive, mimetic, gestural, and cognitive. There is no language in itself, nor are there any linguistic universals. Only a throng of dialects, patois, slangs, and specialized languages. There is no ideal speaker-listener, any more than there is a homogeneous linguistic community. Language is, in Weinreich's words, an essentially heterogeneous reality. There is no mother tongue, only a power takeover by a dominant language within a political multiplicity. Language stabilizes around a parish, a bishopric, a capital. It forms a bulb. It evolves by subterranean stems and flows along river valleys or train tracks. It spreads like a patch of oil. It is always possible to break a language down into internal structural elements, an undertaking not fundamentally different from a search for roots. There is always something genealogical about a tree. It is not a method for the people. A method of the rhizome type, on the contrary, can analyze language only by decentering it onto other dimensions and other registers. A language is never closed upon itself except as a function of impotence. The rhizome is going to tend towards this spontaneous kind of register shift. It is constantly going to entertain these skits flows, whereby it's kind of like a CD that just kind of randomly skips, or it's scratched, so there's these random breaks. And this is in fact how the rhizome functions. That it is not this steady binary like we had before of appearance and the subterranean reality, or this is reality and this is the signifier that helps us obtain this reality qua signify. No. The rhizome, we have to remember, is a process, and thus there is no in itself, but rather there's this multiplicitous range of, like they said, patois, of dialects, and of languages that get chosen. And thus, language itself expresses this rhizomaticism, which is to say that it is constantly entertaining these register shifts, like the great vowel shift that we have in English, for example. And as such, we can see that present within every process, even that which appears arborescent, can actually be turned into a rhizome if in fact we remember not to insist upon the ideal. We rather want to insist on the process, not presence, but process, because presence is going to take us into this binary thinking of presence and not presence. Rather, they want to see reality as pure process, that everything that is process and change and multiplicity. They say multiplicities are rhizomatic and expose arborescent pseudo-multiplicities for what they are. There is no unity to serve as a pivot in the object, or to divide in the subject. There is not even the unity to abort in the object or return in the subject. A multiplicity has neither subject nor object, only determinations, magnitudes, and dimensions that cannot increase in number without the multiplicity changing in nature. And this is an important point which I continually, as I read through Deleuze and Guattari, I'm like, man, I would love to know how this relates to the work of Homi Bhabha with his talk about untranslatability in the Unheimlich. But we can see that multiplicities in difference is going to expose pseudo-multiplicities, which would be the arborescent, this idea of the ideal or the transcendent, and in fact shows that there is not subject or object, because Deleuze and Guattari think that the rhizome is reality, just as the body without organs is. And flows are constitutive of the rhizome, or the assemblage, because the rhizome can essentially be synonymous with the assemblage. It's this grouping of flows with deterritorializations and lines of flight. But in fact, there is no subject or object here in the rhizome. There are merely determinations, magnitudes, we talked about that before as intensities, intensive differences, and dimensions, the scale of all this and the extent to which it projects. And all of this can't increase or change without multiplicity changing in nature, which is to say, any change that happens at any part of the rhizome will be immediately related to the entire assemblage itself. This is important, and Deleuze and Guattari actually are similar to Judith Butler in this way. Judith Butler says, we must not insist on a pre-social ontology, which is to say, we must not insist that what is real is structured by something that is pre-social, that comes before social relations come to create, discourses and things like this. No. Everything is social insofar as the flows which drive production and drive reality itself are social by being related to everything as a multiplicity. They do want to insist that these lines of flight are not simple. They are not simple to find. They're not simple to act upon or localize precisely. Because, essentially, this is a chaotic system, like chaos theory. This is not a determinate, easily definable structure. Because, of course, it's not a structure. When we think of a structure, we think of definite multiplicities within this structure, and it can be identifiable by localizing each of these multiplicities. But the rhizome is not a structure. It's an assemblage, which is defined not as having these separate objects, which are understood within the unity of the structure, the structuring field by which this comes to be. Instead, the assemblage is defined by this intensive communication by which every flow is structured by every other flow, not merely in their differences, like we talked about here, but through their intimate relation and through their equiprimordiality with one another, to use kind of a Heideggerian term. And they say every rhizome contains lines of segmentarity, according to which it is stratified, territorialized, organized, signified, attributed, etc., as well as lines of deterritorialization, down which it constantly flees. There is a rupture in the rhizome whenever segmentary lines explode into a line of flight. But the line of flight is part of the rhizome. These lines always tie back to one another. Which is to say, these lines of flight, of course, are able to appear or to come forth through a break, through an opening in the rhizome, so to speak. And not only a localizable opening, but an opening in relation to structures, like this kind of tuber that I drew here. That the things which allow the lines of flight to come about are not only wholes in and of themselves, but relational wholes, relational openings, which because of that mean that the lines of flight are part of the rhizomatic structure itself. So by using these lines of flight, and this is extremely important, we are not getting out of the rhizome. We shouldn't want to do that. In a sense, this is how capitalism and schizophrenia are so close to one another. They think that capitalism embraces a rhizomatic structure by using capital, which constantly embraces lines of flight, goes beyond itself in order to envelop everything. They think that this is pretty close to the schizophrenic way, or the schizophrenic model of understanding desiring production. But the difference, of course, is that capital becomes the structuring principle, and it is always trying to escape itself and trying to go beyond the capital. It must expand, like with colonialism, and it must absorb that which it is not. These lines of flight are not trying to escape and apprehend that which one is not. This is the problem that they see with Lacan, which is Lacan sees desire essentially as lack, because desire is oriented at that which is outside of oneself. That, oh, if I had this, I would be whole, and without it, I am merely a deficient being chasing after the objet A, that object that I am oriented towards, which defines my subjectivity as a lack. Deleuze and Guattari want to say that these lines of flight are not aimed at absorbing that which the rhizome is not, but they want to see the lines of flight as something that one should entertain and travel along in order to change the rhizome, changing its nature, like we said before. That in fact, the way these lines of flight are acted upon and the processes which ensue from them are of course going to cause the structure to reterritorialize. This is kind of the problem with revolutions that want to end in some sort of new state. Like you think of the Russian Revolution, which overthrew the previous government but only to establish a new state. And of course, this was kind of a transitional state in communism that was talked about by Lenin. But the problem is that when we view revolution like this, as absorbing that which one is not, we will naturally tend towards merely new arborescent structures, new definite binarisms which will close lines of flight and lead us into a sort of despotism. Instead, they think that the lines of flight should be engaged with for the rhizome's sake, for the sake of reality and altering reality as such. And in terms of a formula, so to speak, for establishing or interacting with the rhizome, because one of the key things about Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is that it has extended to everything. It is a driving force in philosophy, sociology, city planning, ecology, everything you can think of, all sorts of artistic endeavors, because they're insisting on production in every field, in taking advantage of all the materials that are at one's feet already, not trying to go out and get that which one is lacking. They say, no, what we have is reality, which is desire. And we can alter these flows of desires through creative processes. And in this way, they're sincerely indebted to Nietzsche. They say, always follow the rhizome by rupture. Lengthen, prolong, and relay the line of flight. Make it vary until you have produced the most abstract and tortuous of lines of n dimensions and broken directions. Conjugate deterritorialized flows. Follow the plants. You start by delimiting a first line consisting of circles and of convergence around successive singularities. Then you see whether inside that line new circles of convergence establish themselves, with new points located outside the limits and in other directions. Write, form a rhizome, increase your territory by deterritorialization. Extend the line of flight to the point where it becomes an abstract machine covering the entire plane of consistency. The rhizome and the rhizomatic process is not obtained in here any more than it is attained by the lines of flight. Because the lines of flight and the process which we engage in by following them, by lengthening them, by prolonging them, by relaying them, by acting upon them, is the rhizomatic process itself. The creative process itself is extending these breaks and finding the holes and breaking through these holes, finding those actions which are untranslatable within the semiotic system, that can't be accounted for without making a veritable effect on the system itself. And at some point, you are extending the line of flight, as they say, so much that it becomes an abstract machine. This abstractness is das Unheimliche, the uncanny, that which cannot be accounted for and can merely be awed at, and creates a drive, creates this moving force towards creativity itself. And they talk about it throughout this first chapter that, creativity is in Chomsky's philosophy too. But the problem with Chomsky is he thinks that this creativity is limited. And by limiting this creativity, it's almost like saying you have no choice but to produce. It's not saying produce as an imperative, but rather stating it as a rule that ties one down to creativity that's not even creativity anymore. It's rather choosing from a definite list of possible linguistic possibilities through an arborescent structure. As we've done this, I've kind of forgotten about the list at various points because this work is so exciting. Really, we've covered principles 3 and 4 as well. Principle 3 is multiplicity. This is saying that there are only lines of magnitude and variability. There is no subject-object, there is just process produced by intensive differences and flows of desire. In principle 4, the asignifying rupture is just what we've done. The lines of flight are ruptures which open up in the assemblage and allow the assemblage to move in a rhizomatic fashion. Because the important thing to note is that while the rhizome is a concept in biology, they want to think of the rhizome, Deleuze and Guattari, as a process of that which one can become. Just like they have a plateau in here called How Can One Become a Body Without Organs? The body without organs is not an object, but that which one approaches through the middle, so to speak. And as such, this asignifying rupture is merely saying that we have lines of segmentarity that tend to rupture through these lines of flight. And thus, this principle 4, this rupture, this tending towards a rupture, is what I think would be better called the principle of deterritorialization. Just as Hegel thinks that things will tend to self-sublate through the postulation of their difference, which is inherent to their identity, so too Deleuze and Guattari think that deterritorialization is a natural occurrence because no system will be totalizable, because flows are not total, they are not absolute, they are multiplicitous and various, and thus in the space between those variations, lines of flight erupt. Now, this 5th principle is rather important, the principle of cartography, which is to say that the rhizome is essentially productive. This is something you will have known from Anti-Oedipus if you've read Anti-Oedipus or know anything about it, which is that reality is strictly a process of desiring production. Like we said, it's not a question of some desires being real and some not, like people being complicit in Nazism. It's a question of how did that desire come to be realized or allowed to bring itself forth, so to speak. And this idea of cartography might sound kind of weird, but I think this is actually one of the more intuitive principles of the rhizome. And it's important that we note the French here. There is a difference between drawing and tracing. For Deleuze and Guattari, drawing is productive. Drawing is following lines of flight, making new things. Whereas tracing, is in reference to some antecedent. Tracing is following a model or following a rule. Deleuze and Guattari don't like rules very much, and we can thank them for that. But to draw, they use the French word tracer, whereas to trace, they use the word décalquer. And it's important to note that drawing is the substance of cartography, of the map, and tracing is arborescence. Tracing is we have a model that is going to structure how reality is based on this structural term, the phallus, Oedipus, some sort of significatory apparatus, the code in Baudrillard. Instead, they want to say the rhizome is altogether different, a map and not a tracing. Make a map, not a tracing. The orchid does not reproduce the tracing of the wasp. It forms a map with the wasp, in a rhizome. What distinguishes the map from the tracing is that it is entirely oriented towards an experimentation and contact with the real. The map does not reproduce an unconscious, closed in upon itself. It constructs the unconscious. It fosters connections between fields and the removal of blockages on bodies without organs, the maximum opening of bodies without organs onto a plane of consistency. It is itself a part of the rhizome. And they state it more explicitly here that this map of desire this map that is created by the rhizome through these intensive differences, is the unconscious itself. The unconscious is not the without. It's not some, it's not some empty objet which is outside that one has to apprehend, because this is Lacan. Instead, desire and the map, which is reality, is the rhizome itself in this process of experimentation. And this is where we can see their work relating to things in like experimental music. They were very fond of Pierre Boulez, for example. And for them, Boulez was getting at, taking these lines of flight to their very limits, taking us out of this structural lens of harmony and rhythm and meter, and into this open land of really frightening experimentation. This attempt to contact the real through the process of reality. Because for them, reality is not a stagnant entity. No, it is an infinitely altering and congealing flow, which is better understood as a process and thus as action. So for them, what makes art and aesthetics and poetry and any of these creative processes, what makes them real is becoming rhizomatic. This process of becoming. For example, Guattari did an essay, Becoming Woman, where he links sexuality to this idea of becoming, of not being, but rather of deterritorializing sexuality and making it into a collective assemblage with others. Later they talk about maps having to do with performance, and I think that's the important part that makes Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy so difficult, is they want to talk about performative processes. They do not want to talk about ideal processes or absolute processes, but they want to talk about multiplicitous processes resulting from intensities. So the fifth principle of cartography is really just asking us to focus on reality as a productive drive. A drive which is not oriented towards an objet A. It is not trying to become what it is not. It is merely becoming. It is in the process of becoming as that which it is, not that which it is yet to be. One thing that they think is a problem is, for example, they take obviously great problems with psychoanalysis, and they say, take psychoanalysis as an example again. It subjects the unconscious to arborescent structures, hierarchical graphs, recapitulatory memories, central organs, the phallus tree, not only in its theory, but also in its practice of calculation and treatment. Psychoanalysis cannot change its method in this regard. It bases its own dictatorial power upon a dictatorial conception of the unconscious. Psychoanalysis's margin of maneuverability is therefore very limited. In both psychoanalysis and its object, there is always a general, always a leader, General Freud. Schizoanalysis, on the other hand, treats the unconscious as an a-centered system. In other words, as a machinic network of finite automata, a rhizome, and thus arrives at an entirely different state of the unconscious. When Freud and Lacan are thinking about the unconscious, they think it has these definite roots, which are pre-conscious, which are instilled in one. Why? Because Freud and Lacan says so. and then they make unfalsifiable theories such that they have to be a necessary precondition to talk about the subject the way they do. And this is the problem that Deleuze and Guattari point out when they say that it's based on a dictatorial conception of the unconscious, which is to say, the way they talk about the unconscious forces us to presuppose a particular preconscious. The way we talk about the trunk and the branches and the leaves necessitates talking about a certain specific root structure. Instead, and really these roots is what they mean by the general, as in like a military general. It's something which structures and sets things straight as a law. They think that instead, this is a machinic network. The rhizome is a machinic process, and thus this sixth idea of the decalcomania is essentially the rhizome is an a-centered, non-hierarchical, non-signifying system without a general and without an organizing memory or central automaton, defined solely by a circulation of states. This is Deleuze and Guattari insisting against the significatory. They think semiotics is based on a sort of dictatorial definition of reality that forces us to presuppose certain terms, like the phallus or Oedipus. They say instead, why must we insist upon the real in such a way that we have to presuppose certain things? Why do we have to presuppose this idea that desire is lack? Why can't desire be production? Why must there be an objet out there? Why, instead, can't we recognize this as a productive process which will bring out its own changes and which is thus intensively creative? We can instead simply look upon this as non-hierarchical. There are no privileged terms here. The lines of flight, even though they may appear as more important terms, are in fact, because of their relation and their commutability, principle number one, with everything else, they are equally as important insofar as the action which they create is the very active assemblage which is the rhizome itself. And thus, they say this line of flight does not mean anything independent of the entire assemblage itself. That what the line of flight is a social phenomenon. It is engaged in the assemblage as a whole and cannot be understood in its being except as a multiplicity in an assemblage which is oriented towards these lines of flight and towards its own deterritorialization through intensive differences. Now, I know this is a very vocabulary dense lecture, and I know that 1,000 Plateaus is particularly daunting, and I certainly have not given you everything in here. I'm trying to make this a little bit shorter, but I hope this gives you the thrust needed to entertain 1,000 Plateaus. Now, the great question is, should you read Anti-Oedipus before you read 1,000 Plateaus? I think so. I think Anti-Oedipus, as difficult as it may seem, is actually not that difficult of a work insofar as Deleuze and Guattari's kind of, I don't even know, their way of action feels very familiar. And maybe this is more of a personal taste thing, but you will find very quickly when you read Deleuze and Guattari that what they're saying makes a lot of sense. Now, sometimes they use a lot of vocabulary and lots of crazy things that you kind of have to read back. But I think Anti-Oedipus lays out very well their critique of the tripartite structure of the phallus and Oedipus and the castration complex. It lays out what desire and production is, what the body without organs is, which I think is really helpful for this. It is going to lay out the difference between capitalism and schizophrenia, which I think gives you a way of figuring out, well, what is the difference between a rhizomatic process as the skits flow and as the flow of capital. What is the difference? I think that is pretty important to know. I think you could probably get away with it because they do say that they want to structure 1,000 plateaus as a series of plateaus, which are apprehended and approached from the middle. And thus they say you could start this book wherever you want. And that would be entertaining its rhizomatic structure. Maybe that's the case. I haven't read the whole book, so I'm not going to, again, tell you that for a fact. But in my opinion, I think Anti-Oedipus is something useful to have under your belt before you read this. But nevertheless, I hope this has been a joy. I hope this gives you some food for thought. Hopefully it should. And I'll see you in another lecture.